Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, we're back again here. We're close to the end of September, getting close to training camp and preseason, but we're continuing our off-season discussions. This time what we're going to do is we're going to pretty much have 5 questions from each of us prepared. We don't know what the other is asking going into this, right? So we're hoping that we don't have the same questions or overlap. But we'll start off now just to kind of get it going. And the first question that I had was, which team do we think is going to make a leap going into this season? And so if you saw our short, right, you may have already kind of seen a preview of our responses. So I had the San Antonio Spurs, right? And I picked them as a team. And we both picked the under on the team in terms of wins, right? But I think we're still believing that they're going to be better and take a leap because you have Wemby, right, who we both believe is going to continue to progress as a player, could even be as good as top 5, I think top 10 for sure. You have De'Aaron Fox. We barely saw both of those guys play together last year, right, because he was traded there near the deadline, and then Wemby had the blood clots, and then that was that. And that's the other factor is that you got Wemby and Fox. They've barely played together. Wemby barely played last season. He missed almost half the season, and the Spurs still won 34 games. It went 34-48, which isn't a great record, right? But maybe if Wemby plays 60 games, right, maybe they're closer to 40 wins. Maybe they're actually 500. And then you have the bevy of young players. They added Dylan Harper. They added Carter Bryant. Of course, they still have Stephon Castle, who was the Rookie of the Year. Still have Jeremy Sohan, and they still have some vets, right? They added some vets like Luke Cornett, Kelly Olynyk. They still have Harrison Barnes. So they have a lot of, players on the team. Devin Vassell, also there, right? Keldon Johnson, also there. So they have a lot of solid players on the team. My concern still is going to be the three-point shooting, just because I don't think they have a lot of great outside shooters. And I think if you're going to win, if you're going to expect them to win a lot of regular season games and maybe make the playoffs, that's going to have to improve from what it was last season. And I'm just not sold that everybody's going to figure out the jump shooting right away, right? Like Castle was not a great outside shooter last year. Maybe he'll be better, but I don't expect him to go from what he was last year to all of a sudden like a really good, strong three-point shooter. That might be a little bit of a stretch. Fox, even him, he's a streaky outside shooter, right? And he's going to be playing alongside, a number of guys who are not great outside shooters, but you're not worried about his production at all necessarily. Dylan Harper, right? The guy they drafted. He's not necessarily so far shown that he's a strong outside shooter, but he's a great athlete. So that's the nice thing about the Spurs is they do have a lot of long athletic players. They got a ton of size, and they have a mix of vets and young players. So I think that this could be a team where, they weren't as bad as Detroit was a couple seasons ago, right? So you're not expecting them to triple their win total. But I think that's, for me in the Western Conference, a team that I would pick to take a pretty significant leap compared to a lot of those, because especially when you look at the Western Conference, we know that the conference is going to be deep. There's going to be a lot of good teams. But how many teams do you expect to be significantly better than they were last year in terms of winning way more games? It's not that, even though there are a number of teams that have improved, I don't think they're going to win. There's going to be as much of a leap in terms of the wins as the San Antonio Spurs. So that's the team that I would look out for.
Yeah, I think that's a great team, especially if you want to, look at the West. I would have to agree with you if I was, more so focused on the Western Conference, right? You already talked about it. Like you got Victor Wembanyama, and that's pretty much all you really need at that point. But the other guys are really just icing on the cake. And then, to see what De'Aaron Fox and Wemby are going to look like, with a full season under their belt, that'll be awesome, hoping that there's no injuries and stuff like that. And then obviously adding in Dylan Harper and Stephon Castle into the mix as well. It's going to be a really fun team to watch, especially on that defensive end for sure. I have similar logic in terms of, the defensive end and, the entertainment factor, but the team that I chose was in the Eastern Conference. It was the Atlanta Hawks. I think after the offseason that they had, phenomenal, right? I think, they definitely had one of the best off seasons that we graded for sure. They made great additions, in terms of getting Porzingis. You signed Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Luke Kennard, and you also got a future, first round pick. So obviously A+ for them. But in terms of the fit and what we're expecting, internal development wise, from these guys, right? The Atlanta Hawks have a true vision. They have, Trae Young as their hub, their offensive guy, the facilitator. I think I'm expecting him to kind of have like a Halliburton-esque kind of arc this season. I hope, that his numbers are going to be off the charts. But the main thing is, they have that identity, which is, he's surrounded by tons of tall wings that can, guard pretty much 1 through 4. So you can hide him and, scheme a little bit better, I think, in years past, right? Where we kind of looked at the Hawks as, kind of iffy, right? Because of Trae Young's defense alongside the personnel. But now you give him, an inside out lob threat, with Porzingis as well. If he can stay healthy, I think they can really, really make some waves in the Eastern Conference, right? Because there is no clear-cut winner for the Eastern Conference this year right now, right? Like everybody has OKC kind of pegged as #1 top dog in the West, but in the East, it's a little bit more up for grabs for sure. So I think, the Hawks could definitely be, a challenger because last year they were okay. It's just the problem was they got hurt. And they didn't really have the depth pieces to kind of overcome that. So this year, they're deeper, they're stronger, they're faster, and you still have Trae Young at the helm. So I expect them to get right back into playoff contention and take that leap forward.
Right, yeah. And that's the nice thing about the Hawks is they have a good balance, right, of some vets. You have your star in Trae Young, and you have other young players with upside as well, right? Just for them, the main question, like in terms of Porzingis as an addition, right, is can he stay healthy?
Fair.
When he's healthy, he's really good, right? It's just that hasn't been the case as consistently as of late, but they also got him for nothing. So worst case scenario, yeah, he's a bonus, but you do need him to be good. And I'm kind of curious to see the battle with him and Okongwu, right? Because Okongwu took Capella's starting spot.
Yes, he did.
And now, you would kind of feel like based off of pedigree, you would think Porzingis would kind of go in as the starting center. And that's going to be cool, right? Because that's a different big from the previous bigs that they have, because Porzingis is so much more versatile of an offensive player where he can step out to the 3-point line as a stretch guy, but you can also throw the ball to him in the post and he can take advantage of smaller guys being put on him. Because for the Hawks, most of their guys have been role bigs. Like Okongwu's stretched his game out to the 3-point line,
Sure.
but, he's not a guy that you're as concerned about from hurting you from 3 just
right.
because it's still a work in progress, whereas Porzingis is a known commodity as a 3-point shooter, right? So that's kind of something that I'm very curious to see with Jalen Johnson as well, because you said,
big time.
Because he was hurt. When he was playing, he was averaging basically 20 and 10, right? With quality playmaking and quality defense as well, but then he gets hurt, and then the team kind of falls apart. Dyson Daniels most improved. So there's a lot to like about that team from talent perspective, and just, especially like you said in the Eastern Conference with, even though the Cavs and the Knicks are poised to be the 2 favorites, right? People still aren't quite as sold on those teams as they were like maybe Boston a year ago. So, and then obviously the Pacers would have been in the mix as well, but they're not. So
absolutely,
I think the Hawks are definitely going to be one of the most fun teams to watch for sure. And, and again, like the other factor is the Trae Young contract extension, right? Because he hasn't been offered one. And, is it possible that the season's performance could alter that? I think because of the talent, you're not expecting him to average like 30 and 12.
No.
Maybe like he had to in previous years, but you still want to see his normal production combined with like the ability now to play off the ball more, just because you have more offensive options, right? Compared to before, it was like what, DeJounte Murray.
Yep.
It's pretty much the only other guy. That pairing didn't really work out, and they were able to pivot off of it, because I remember we were all pretty low on the Hawks after that trade, and after seeing how it didn't work out, and then we were like, are they really going to be that good? But shout out to them. They've actually been able to turn it around in a way that I really didn't expect them to, because it just felt like they just kind of didn't really know what they were doing,
especially so quickly too. It's wild.
Yeah, exactly. That's should be fun. Now, I guess the next question is, which team are we lower on potentially than the general consensus? And that's one that I think might be one that might be kind of fun. So I guess maybe this isn't a fair one, right? So maybe this one is like not as great of a pick. I had the Mavs just because for me, I just don't expect Kyrie to necessarily come back that quickly. Anthony Davis, he might be back early on, but I just think there's going to be a lot more growing pains than maybe some people expect. Just like with Cooper Flag, he's going to have to develop. He's going to have to be a guy that can, figure out some of the offensive woes with this team early on. He's going to have the ball in his hands a lot more, and I just don't necessarily know if it's going to be quite as smooth as some people are expecting. And like I said, maybe that's kind of a cheap one, just because I don't, it's not like people are expecting the Mavs to be a top 3 seed, and but I just feel like that one, it wouldn't surprise me if the Mavs just aren't that great this season, because they do have a lot of good players, but I don't think that they fit together, and I think it's going to be a work in progress compared to what some people think. But that could just be me.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would agree with you. I think we've been, singing that tune pretty much, since Cooper Flag got drafted there. And then obviously we already knew about the injury woes that team has right now currently. So, similar situation to the Spurs where, yeah, you love the potential, you love it on paper, but we need to see it happen. And we also need to see how they overcome the growing pains with that one. This is a tough one for me because I don't know how a lot of people feel about this team, but I know how their fans feel about this team, and they are generally high on the team somehow, some way. I think it's borderline delusion, but Milwaukee Bucks. I'm sorry, I can't get behind this team being good, no matter what the Eastern Conference looks like. Right? Obviously, yes, Giannis, top 3 player, arguably top 2 at times, in the league, if you want to put him that high, right? But that's just not enough for me personally. Look at the roster, right? You have Miles Turner. That's about it. Kyle Kuzma, I don't think he's going to be that much of a help to you this season, maybe regular season wise, but at the end of the day, this team has their sights set on a championship, as they should, with Giannis at the helm. But the problem is, I think the surrounding talent, the coaching, right? It's just not championship worthy to me. So I think people need to temper their expectations with this team, especially the fans. It's not even really like other people. It's more so the fan base of the Milwaukee Bucks. They need to chill out. Yes, you have Giannis. Yes, he is great. Yes, he will have an MVP caliber season pretty much every single year, but it's not going to be enough to get you back to the NBA Finals. And I think they need to come back to reality on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see. Again, I think the main case for the Bucks, maybe a strong one that you could make, is they could be a team that could win more regular season games than people expect because they're in the East and they have Giannis as long as he's healthy. It's just playoff wise, I think that's the part that's going to be tough because you're going to have to expect a lot of those non-Giannis guys to contribute on the offensive end. And I just think the offensive talent that they have to work with after him, it's just too much of a drop off where I don't think you should expect, guys like Kevin Porter Jr. and Gary Trent Jr. to, outplay some of the other guards, on these other teams, like say the Cavs backcourt or, even the Knicks offensive guys. I think that's a very tall task to ask the Bucks to be able to pull off. And that's a team, to be honest, where, like I said, you could go in either direction and you do kind of wonder, right? Like what's going to happen as the season goes on, just because we know Giannis for now is not going anywhere. And he could just stay this whole season, right? Like he may not get moved at all, but you do kind of wonder, like, if they come out of the gates and they struggle, or if like the first half of the season they're just not that great, right? Does it get louder, in terms of what potentially goes on? I guess moving on to the next question, what non-Oklahoma City contender are you higher on, are you higher on probably than some people might have? And I mean, like this one, again, could be a question that's like, maybe there's some obvious answers here. I think for me, I'm going to have the Nuggets just because of the fact that they added depth, right? So they have more than 5 guys that can really contribute. I guess you could say they had 6 last year, if you count Russell Westbrook. But, Michael Porter Jr. is gone. They replaced him with Cam Johnson. Then they brought in Tim Hardaway Jr., Bruce Brown, Valanciunas to round out the bench. They still have some more flexibility, so they could do more, maybe by the deadline if they wanted to. Don't know if they will. But their starting 5 was very good last year, and now they're not going to have to be stretched as paper thin because they have more guys that they can actually slide in there. And then, say with a guy like a Tim Hardaway Jr., the Nuggets have been a team the last couple of years that, they make threes at a decent clip. They just don't get off a lot of them. But now you have more guys who can knock down some outside jumpers, right? So now that might make their offense a little bit more versatile than it was in the past, right? And you still got Jokic, right, who's one of the best players in the league, right? I think, he's still considered the best player in the world. And then you still got, the other players around him. Obviously the last couple of seasons, right, they got knocked out in the second round. And, it seems like now they're poised and ready to make the comeback. And it wouldn't surprise me if Oklahoma City, if they didn't make it out of the West, that it would be Denver, right? Because they were very close to taking out Oklahoma City last year. And it feels like they've gotten better, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good pick. I would agree with that. I would go with Houston. Right, I think this is one of the teams that also had a phenomenal offseason, right? You just slot in Kevin Durant, you get rid of Jalen Green, you get rid of Dylan Brooks, but obviously the core identity of your team is still very much intact, right? You just add a closer to pair with, Şengün, and that takes pressure off of him in terms of having to rely on him, in late game situations, and maybe his game can be much more well-rounded, right? So cool that we got to see a little bit of a sneak peek with him, in the Eurobasket, right? Amin Thompson, we saw him in the summer, weight room for sure. He seems to be getting stronger, faster, even more athletic somehow, and we already know what KD is as well. Fred VanVleet, I think that's a key piece as well because, what does he look like, in a system where, yeah, he doesn't have to necessarily, shot chuck anymore. Right now, it's KD who's going to be taking the majority of the shots. But Fred VanVleet can kind of go back to actually being a legit point guard instead of undersized shooting guard. So overall, I really love what they have going over there. Their identity, the fact that they can play tall, they can play small if they want, but their height and their size is really what's going to make a difference for them. I think being able to pretty much play four guys that are 6'10" and up, while also having a solid guard out there as well. And defensively, we already know that's what's really going to carry them far. And adding a guy like KD into that system, I think, is going to be amazing. So, I might be spoiling, some future talks that we'll be having later on. But yeah, Houston's my team for sure.
Yeah, that'll be a fun team to watch. And I think that, you can go in a lot of different directions with that one, right? Because like you said, you mentioned the upside of the young players. You added Kevin Durant, who can obviously contribute offensively in the ways that they didn't really have that. But you could also make the case that because of his age, right, is there a potential, for them to maybe not get quite as far? But either way, I think you make the case that they should be better than they were last year just because you added a guy who's better than the guys that they added. You're not really taking away anything. Maybe you're a little bit less athletic, but you're just adding a more proven guy to this group, right? And you have the young players and the defense to round out and balance it out, right? So I think overall it's a win, 100%, and they're going to be in the mix in the Western Conference, trying to compete for that championship. The next question, and this one is one where it's like, what's kind of the biggest storyline that you're kind of looking forward to this season, right? Or just maybe most intriguing storyline to you. And I think one storyline that I'm kind of looking at, and this one might not be as interesting to some, but I think it's kind of interesting just how, you're going into the season and, say like last year, right? The three older guys, right? LeBron, Steph, and KD, right? You're going into last season where I think really only one of those teams was kind of looked at as like actually having maybe a decent chance of winning, right? The Suns, right? Like, going into last season, nobody was really that high on either the Lakers or Golden State because, you looked at the rosters and you're like, not really buying it a whole lot, right? But people like the Suns. This year is a little bit different. We don't expect, you don't really see people picking any of those three teams to win the championship. But I think just the fact that now you're going in and you're like, oh, these teams could be, good teams. These are teams that could certainly maybe mess around and win some playoff series, or in the case of Houston, maybe go even further. And you do just kind of wonder, right? Because you look at these teams and it's like, well, with the Lakers and LeBron, everybody's kind of trying to figure out, whether or not this is his last year with the Lakers. Is this even his last year in the league, right? Of course, with Houston, you're trying to see like, Durant, how much of a difference does he make? And then, of course, with Steph and the Warriors, can they even really compete and contend? And that's kind of where I'm like, which guy is the one that may be the most likely to kind of come out of this without another ring? Like, obviously they all have multiple
Mm,
championships, and it might have to be it may have to be Steph, just because I think for the Warriors, I think that's the team that you and I are probably the lowest on. Um, Even though I'm higher on them than you. And then obviously with the Lakers and LeBron, of course, like, there's always a case of LeBron. Let's say if something happens and he doesn't want to be there, he could just go somewhere else, right? Like, you're not anticipating that he's a lock to 100% lock to stay with the Lakers the way that Steph is. And I don't necessarily know if the Warriors have as many levers to make their team better, right? Compared to, say, what Houston and the Lakers have to work with, just because of, the combination of the young stars and the veteran stars. But it is something that I'm just kind of curious to see, just because last year there was kind of a constant battle in terms of media discussions about, like, how much do we continue to kind of talk about these guys versus giving, the young guys more of a credence. And they've done a better job going into this season, because you can see the schedule, you can see which teams now have gotten a bump in terms of games. So it's a storyline that I am interested in. But
yeah.
maybe it's not for others.
No, I think that's a good one. I think it's a really niche one for sure, because it is a very, very small demographic, right? We're pretty much talking about 3 players here, right? So, that is a pretty good one. But, obviously they bring in, the most viewership out of any of the stars right now. So I would agree with
Yeah.
that one. That one's a pretty good one. I hadn't thought of anything like that. Um, Mine is probably a little bit more hot takey, but
Hmm.
I'm more intrigued with who's going to be representing the Eastern Conference and how that turns out, more so than
Okay.
what the West looks like, right? Like, okay, the West could end up being, I don't know, say like Houston or Oklahoma City. Whoop de doo, right? Like, okay, that's fine.
Right.
But like in the Eastern Conference, I feel like that could literally be anybody. And even if it
Yeah.
is, say, like New York, I think that's a
Mhm.
bigger deal than it is, for like Houston or Oklahoma City to go back to the finals, right?
Mhm.
So that's kind of what I'm looking at. I'm going to be intrigued at what the landscape of the Eastern Conference is going to look like by the time we get to the NBA finals.
Oh yeah, for sure. And because, like you said, with the Eastern Conference, it feels just there's just not as much. Because I think with the West, it just feels more like it's Oklahoma City, and then it's everybody else.
Right.
But if Oklahoma City doesn't get in there, right, I think most people probably might lean towards Denver, then maybe Houston, but not really anybody else, right? At least as of right now. But in the Eastern Conference, like you said, the Cavs and the Knicks are poised as the favorites right now. But last year, right, Boston was poised as the favorite, and they didn't even get past the second round, right?
Right.
And then after Boston, then you were like, oh, now it's the Knicks. And then it's like, nope, it actually was the Indiana Pacers, right? And they were one game away from winning the NBA championship, right? So in the Eastern Conference, you definitely could look at that conference and say, like, oh yeah, there's a team that could potentially have a Pacers run in here because of the injuries to the Celtics and the Indiana Pacers, right? Who we did our tiers last week in the East, right? Those would have been tier one teams if they were healthy. I mean, because I think the Celtics may have approached the offseason a little bit differently if Tatum doesn't tear his Achilles, right? Um, and then the Pacers, I think you probably assume they bring back Miles Turner. If Halliburton doesn't get hurt, certainly if they win the championship, you would hope they would have. But just either way, yeah, I mean, because you look at the Eastern Conference, and yeah, like outside of the Cavs and the Knicks, like of course, some of these other teams have a chance. They're not going to be looked at as likely, but we know every year injuries happen, just like last year. Weird things happen in the playoffs, right? I.e., look at what happened with the Pacers in all their series, where every time you counted them out, they came back. I mean, I can't expect every team to be like that, but just there's definitely a pathway for an Eastern Conference team that we're not looking at as a real threat to come out of the East to actually get out of there. And that, like you said, that's a storyline to watch, just because there's just so many possibilities
Oh
there,
yeah.
right? I mean, because even like I said, even beyond the Cavs and the Knicks, you got the Magic, you got the Hawks. I mean, I guess after that, I think it's probably less likely, but you just never know, right? Like maybe you have some injuries and then the Pistons somehow magically end up in the conference finals, or maybe even a team like the Bucks or something like that, or maybe the Raptors pull off a first round upset, or Philly. That's the other team, because nobody's really talked about Philly at all because of their injuries, right? But we have seen the skinnier version of Joel Embiid. So maybe that combined with all the guys that they have, maybe they kind of pull off something. It's hard to really bank on it. Just seems like at this point, not really a team you can rely on. But that's definitely, I think, one of these biggest storylines going into next season because when you look at the playoffs, right, it's East and West, and we're mostly penciling in who we expect to be a Western Conference player or powerhouse, but not as much in the Eastern Conference.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So, next question. So, which of the bottom feeder teams, right, are probably going to be the most entertaining to actually watch, right? Because there's some teams where we expect them to be bad, but probably not really as interesting. But then there's other teams where it's like, oh, this might actually be kind of fun, right? This might actually be an interesting team to watch. It's and I'll just have this. It's the team that I can't quit on for whatever reason. Like I just can't give up on them. They're my kryptonite. They're my comfort food, and and I'm gonna go with the Charlotte Hornets.
It's a good pick
because I still don't expect them to be great. They've
Okay.
been cooked in terms of injuries every year.
Okay.
All their guys usually miss significant time.
Okay.
But I just feel like if I can actually see some type of 2, 3, 4 week stretch where they're actually healthy, they could actually be very entertaining because you have LaMelo Ball, you have Brandon Miller, you have all the young guys they just drafted like Con Knipple and Liam McNeely. You still have Tijan Salan. Not really any help in terms of centers, right? I don't actually know who their best center is. It might be Mason Plumlee, which is not a good thing.
Right.
But I do think that could be one of the more fun teams that could be like a sneaky league pass team if they're actually healthy. But I guess you could make the case maybe they're not a bottom feeder team if they're actually healthy. I still wouldn't expect them to be a playoff team though, so they're gonna be a lottery team, I think, more than likely.
Yeah, that's a good pick. I was tempted to choose them as well. I'm low key tempted to go with Utah though, because
Okay.
I feel like they have a plethora of young guys that have a lot to prove, right? Like it'll be led by potentially Ace Bailey, right? You have Cody Williams, who I think we're expecting to look like an NBA player this season, right? You have Keontae George, like the list goes on and on. So I think if they can somewhat just find a lineup that works, and can maximize the talents of some of those young guys on that team, I think it'll be fun, right? We already talked about it, right? Play Ace Bailey at the 2, that could be pretty cool, right? We've seen that he can have a scorer's mentality, so right, like let's make the game simple for him, while also having guys like Walker Kessler out there, Markkanen as well. And, Filipowski, right? So these guys are versatile, and I think they're extremely underrated. I think it's a matter of finding a way to get these guys to gel together without necessarily having your franchise guy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of funny because I did cheat and have just like an extra question. And it was kind of like in the lines of like, what guy would it not completely shock me if somehow he ended up getting traded? It actually was Lauri Markkanen.
Okay. Makes sense, yeah.
Just because of the Jazz have not been great. Of course, they're in rebuild mode, but he did, I think, up his stock with a lot of people with his Eurobasket play. Of course, it's not the NBA, but it does matter just because a few seasons ago, right, he was looked at as one of the hottest commodities in the league, but now he's on that huge contract, and I don't necessarily feel like he's quite a number one. And so could it be a scenario where maybe if the Jazz have another bad year, could he be traded somewhere else? Could he fit in? Could it be like a team like one of those Eastern Conference teams that we talked about? Like, could it be Detroit that manages to pick up like a Lauri Markkanen, or somebody like that, right? Like that could be a team where he could potentially make a real difference with them, especially if they don't have to give up the farm, in heaven and earth,
Yeah.
in order to get him. So that could be a guy where he could be one of those guys that we talked about, where like really good player on a bad team that could get moved and could be a team that could maybe swing some things, especially if it's, like I said, a team in the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I don't know if you had any cheap extra ones that you wanted to toss our way, but you can if you want.
No, I do have my questions though. I guess we'll start and get a little bit more specific and address, I guess, the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Do you think the Oklahoma City Thunder will repeat and go back to back? I know that's the question that everybody wants to kind of answer and figure
Yeah.
out.
So.
I mean, me personally,
Mhm.
I think they can, but I don't know if they will. And
Right.
that's why I'm
Yes
kind
and no.
of, yeah, like they have it in them, right? But history's not on their side.
Right. Yep.
So
Yeah.
I think I'm going to learn my lesson this year and veer away from that. So I'm going to say they will not repeat, but they can, if that makes any sense
Yeah.
whatsoever.
It's funny because this is the question of that, or this is the question that repeats itself constantly, right?
Yeah.
Like history repeats itself because we've kind of asked this pretty much every year. In terms of like, oh yeah, this team that just won the championship is really poised to be even better than last
Yeah.
year and go back to back all the way back to, I think the last time that we probably didn't feel that way was Toronto, right? Because they lost Kawhi,
Pretty much.
right? So that one is like, yeah, that no brainer if they don't be as good as the year before, right? But like all the way back to say the championship Laker team, right, where everybody's like, oh, they might have improved because they brought in like Dennis Schroeder and Marc Gasol and Montrezl Harrell, and they were really good. And then LeBron and AD got hurt, and the season started not long after the previous one ended, so maybe that had something to do with it,
Sure.
right? The Bucks won the championship that following season, and then you're like, okay, well, Giannis is continuing to progress. They got Holiday, they got Middleton, they got some other good players, and then Middleton gets hurt, right? And then they don't end up going back to back. They lose to Boston, who loses to Golden State. Then you look at Golden State, and it's like, well, they might have a strong case because they have all those young guys. Lacob said we have the 2 timeline plan. We can contend in perpetuity. And then Draymond punches Jordan Poole. The young guys don't really progress at all. Now almost all of them are gone, and now it feels like their window's closed, and they didn't win that year either.
Yep.
Then the Nuggets, right? That was the next team where we're like, this is the dynasty. This might be a dynastic team. This might be the team that might win 2, 3 championships because of, not just the fact that they won the chip, but because of how dominant they were during that postseason run. Then what happens, right? Jamal Murray, I guess, in the regular season is hurt.
Mhm.
And then in the playoffs, right, they have that stretch where they run into Minnesota. They are up 20 in the second half and then somehow blow it all. And then their season is over.
Yep.
Right. And then Boston wins the championship and we're like, okay, dynasty for them, even though they may tear down the team after the season because of the CBA. Then Tatum, or they choked the 2 games away against the Knicks, and the Knicks also took it from them. So give them credit there. And then Tatum tears his Achilles, and then that's that. So Oklahoma City, I think, has the strongest case because you have an MVP level guy in SGA, right? He could easily be, I don't know if he will be, but he could easily be a guy who could win MVP again next season.
True.
They have a bunch of young guys with a bunch of upside, and they still have some vets. So, like, there's no reason to feel like that they can't be better, but you always factor in second year. Maybe they don't take it. Maybe they don't go quite as hard over the course of the season as they did the year before. Maybe more injuries pop up because, as we've seen, it's very difficult now to be able to go back to back and be healthy. I mean, we just saw a guy like Tatum who never gets injuries like that, tear his Achilles, and his season's pretty much over before it even starts, right? Maybe he comes back at some point, but we just don't really know. So I would probably lean towards the same thing, right? Where it's like, yeah, maybe I might have to pick somebody else to win the championship, but it would not be shocking to me at all if they go back to back. Like, I mean, who knows? Do they win 70 plus games next year? Maybe if some of these guys are better, we'll see. But, I don't think it's a, complete disgrace, if they don't go back to back. Because as we've seen this decade, it is very difficult to win, let alone win more than one. Nobody's won more than one, right? The
Exactly.
only players that were able to win more than one were some of the role guys that were on multiple teams, right? Like I think this decade, what did I say? I think it was like, Drew Holiday's not a role player, but like it was him, it was Caruso, and I think it was KCP. I think those are the only 3 guys that won multiple titles this decade, right? Where, none of the stars have won more than one. And we might just be in a stretch now where it's like, yeah, a lot of these guys that are like the top players in the league, they may finish with like maybe just 1 title, maybe 2. So I'm curious to see how that reflects in all the all-time player rankings, right? Because say like a guy like a Jokic, right? There's a lot of buzz by a lot of people where they feel like this guy, when he retires, will be top 10 all time. But if you look at top 10 all time, it's a lot of guys where they have like 2, 3 plus titles, right? And, he's so far, he's got one, he's got all the other accolades, but then you also may have to weigh the fact that, well, this decade's been very difficult to win. But, I know that sounds kind of like a tangent, but just for the OKC thing, yeah, I think it's probably more likely than not that they don't go back to back because that's what we've seen. But I think that even though we've said it every year, I do think they actually do have the strongest case just because, unlike Boston, they do have more young guys that have a lot of upside, right? Like I could see J-Dub or Chet Holmgren being even better than they were last year. And you make the case, well, like last year, half the season, they didn't even have their front court healthy. I mean, how many games did Chet Holmgren play last year, right? It couldn't have been more than 60, if that, right? After playing all 82, his rookie year, he missed the whole season. Then he played every game in his technically rookie season, but, second year contract. Last year, he played 32 games. So there's definitely a reason to be even higher on them. I just think it's going to be a lot tougher.
Yeah, that's a good response. I would agree with that.
Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, for my next question, oh boy, let's maybe eliminate Oklahoma City right from the picture here, right? Because general consensus is they have the best young core in the NBA because they won a title. But say in a world that they don't exist, who has the best young core? I think there's so many options here, right? Like you could go with the Spurs, right? Who, have a bunch of guys. Dylan Harper hasn't played a game yet, but, in theory, on paper, looks like it could be fantastic. You have, Detroit, where, you have Cade Cunningham, all NBA guy as well. You have teams like Charlotte that, in theory and, potentially could be good, right? You have LaMelo, who's a 30-point, per game scorer, but is pretty much always hurt alongside Brandon Miller. So you have options, and I think there's a plethora of teams to choose from, but, something's telling me to choose Charlotte, and I've talked about this in the past, right? Where it's like I love LaMelo Ball, I love Brandon Miller, and I think that pairing is awesome. And then you have the new guys they just drafted, Liam McNeely, and Colin Knippel, right? And those guys can fit seamlessly there. Salone as well. So they have a bunch of guys that could easily just all have breakout seasons alongside, their already proven talent. So that's a team that I would pick. It's just a matter of getting over that injury hurdle. But I'm curious to hear what other people would say, because I know a lot of people are super duper high on the Spurs.
Yeah, that would probably be the one that I would go with just because of the fact that you also have Wemby, right, who's young. So he has to be part of the young core, and he'd be, the best young player right now in the league for the most, outside from like, Ant or some of those other guys who are already established, but just in terms of guys in their 23 and lower, right? He would be right there in terms of the best one combined with the other guys. But like you said, they're not. Some of them are not quite as proven. Like say Dylan Harper, he's gonna presumably come off the bench, right? So what does he look like as a rookie, right? Compared to maybe a few seasons from now, he could be a potential all-star caliber guard. I mean, the Western Conference, of course, has a lot of great guards, so that may just be very difficult. But that's probably who I would go with. Maybe some honorable mentions, if you want to mention any of those at all, right?
Yeah.
Just, I mean, I think you look around. Maybe, of course, there's a lot of guys on the Raptors and the Wizards and. But I mean, I think it's just
Portland is a good sleeper one. I would say
Portland's another good one as well. But even for them, you still have questions about Scoot. You still have questions about Shaedon Sharp, and he's really good. But we still need to see more.
Yeah.
And then you still have questions about the guy they just drafted, Hanson Young, Donovan Clingan. How are those guys going to play together? Tamani Kamara, right? He's a little bit older, right? But he still could be a guy that fits into that young core. Denny Avdia, right? So I think Portland's a really good choice as well. I mean, I guess maybe like Utah, you might like some of those young guys, but I feel like, with Charlotte, they're just so much more established that it makes more sense maybe to have them maybe than some of those other teams, but maybe some of those other teams might have higher upside.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with that because there's so many young teams and there's so many young cores as well. So, and they're all in different spots, which is the hilarious part. So that's why I am curious because I feel like the spot that you're in shouldn't necessarily dictate, everything, because in theory, if you want to play that game, then we would have both picked Detroit, right? Because of the fact that they were in the playoffs and you have Cade as an All-NBA guy. But I think there's more foresight that is required here. So the Spurs is definitely a good pick for sure. But I am kind of zagging with the Hornets because I know people are probably going to blow that one up and be like, what is this guy on drugs?
Yeah. And then like I said, I know we're cheating because we said 5 questions, but it's still a fun, topic of things to discuss. Um, I guess one other one, maybe that kind of would be kind of a fun one to try to figure out and brainstorm because I was just thinking about it as we were talking. Is that so? If we're assuming that Tatum either doesn't come back,
Hmm.
right, or maybe if he comes back really late,
Hmm.
right? Like, who would be the best duo in the league right now, right? Because it kind of felt like you may be moving to Tatum and Brown,
Mm.
because they had already, they had won the championship. They've been like a consistent playoff team for the last several years. Of course, there's Jokic and Murray, right? Who won the championship just a couple seasons ago. Then there's the other ones that people would bring up, like before the trades, right? Like Luca and Kyrie, LeBron and AD. Now you have Steph and Jimmy. Not Kawhi and Paul George anymore because they don't play together. But what do you think? I kind of want to hear from you because I think like this is one where there could be a lot of change depending on how this season goes.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm glad you didn't say the duo that I was going to say.
Yeah.
When you were giving examples, because it's an under the radar one, not necessarily forgotten, because we saw how good they were last year. But
Hmm.
give me Cat and Brunson. I think they're going to be phenomenal, right? We're going to run the pick and roll back. It's going to be amazing. Unfortunately, I did pick the Knicks to win the title last year. They came up a little bit short. It is what it is, but I think they're going to be poised for another potential championship run, and it's going to be spearheaded by both of those guys playing their best ball, right? I think in theory the people didn't necessarily like the fit at first. They were like, Karl Anthony Towns to the Knicks, not really the kind of guy that you'd want to bring into that kind of
Right.
culture, right? Is it going to work? Is it going to fit? Stuff like that. But it turned out to be one of the more potent duos, and more potent teams offensively, right? With both those guys, being able to be as versatile as they are, right? Cat also being a great playmaker as well. You bring in Mike Brown as well. I think he's probably going to shake some things up, right? Obviously, Tibbs, he didn't like to stray away from his own game plan, but I think Mike Brown is a little bit more lenient in that factor. So I think we might be able to see, situations where not necessarily freelance, but it's more so like, all right, get the ball to our guys and they pop off, right? Like it should come down to that, right? Where late game, you either want the ball in Brunson's hands, preferably, right, majority of the time, or
Mm-hmm.
have it find its way to Cat, towards the end of the game as well for a spot up opportunity, something of that nature. So I think they're going to be versatile offensively, and obviously, duos obviously are pretty much as good as the team is going to get. So it's like if you add in depth pieces, I think it takes pressure off of those guys, but can also maximize what they can do, right? So these guys are actually going to get breathers in the regular season and postseason due to the fact that they did upgrade at certain positions depth wise, but I think they're going to pop off.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. I'll go with Jokic and Murray just because I think the Nuggets have improved, and I think that's one that is a proven
Yeah,
duo. Maybe that's something that we do, at some point before the season starts where we rank some duos.
yeah, let's
I
do it
can't wait until, that'll be really fun when we get into some of the, even more duos that some people haven't talked about as
for
much, right?
sure.
Maybe like, like say the Bulls, got a backcourt duo going on.
Yeah, man.
Not going to say their names, but you know who I'm talking about.
Oh yeah,
The Kings, right, might potentially have some good duos. So,
right, good, right.
yeah, but just that, but yeah, so I think that's always a fun topic to go with. So let us know your thoughts in the comments about all these questions and all these discussions that we have, and maybe we missed something, maybe you don't agree with what we said. But I think these are always some really fun topics and discussions to talk about, especially going into the season, because we're still waiting for training camp and preseason. So this kind of gives us an opportunity to kind of just discuss a lot of these teams, in maybe more of a group context because we had spent so long, right, doing the off-season talks where we're kind of talking about most of those teams at an individual level, right? Not really talking about them in relation to the rest of the league outside of when we were like, oh, here's the over under. Are we over or under on them? And then like, maybe how far do we see them going? But I think that, those are really fun. So let us know. So now we'll get into some news and rumors around the league. Of course, by the time you're at this point, not like a whole lot really to discuss, just because we're still kind of, in this scenario where, like I said, in terms of the Kaminga stuff, we don't have much to say there because we already said, right, that his agent came up and was just talking about everything. So it's just kind of a weird situation where he's just, I guess, leaking a bunch of stuff about like, um, about like, oh yeah, there are more teams than you guys have heard that are interested in him, or like, if he's gonna be on this team, he wants to be like a real part of the team. I don't know, just I don't really understand it. Don't really know the point of it. I don't know if he's trying to make Kaminga look better. I just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. So I don't know. Maybe you see it differently than I do.
No, I agree with
I
you.
think,
I think it's ridiculous. We've seen this before in other sports and other realms, right? In terms of like player tiers and stuff, but he's not in the tier to be having an agent do this stuff, right?
right.
That's the thing that's kind of frustrating, right? Like he's in the position of, well, he just needs to get on a team and suck it up at this point because there isn't a market, and that's the harsh reality. And I think they're coming to terms with this, and this is probably their ace up the sleeve, but it's backfiring completely, in my opinion.
Yeah, and then like I said, I don't really understand the point of it, just because, how does this make any of this better in this situation? I don't really, get it. And like I said, I don't know what happens, and that could be, we didn't talk about it because it's not, I don't know, it's just not as interesting to me, but it is a storyline at least to look at, because at the very least, right, depending on what happens with Kaminga, that could potentially kind of alter maybe how we see the Warriors going into this. Like I said, it doesn't interest me as much
Me
because you
neither.
know how I feel, and obviously I know how you feel as
Oh
well.
yeah.
But I think at the very least, as we if they actually did a sign and trade and got something back for him, like that could at least make you feel better about it. Plus, they already seemingly have those other deals lined up with the guy still waiting in free agency to figure out what's going on. But as you already heard from me, like if it is the qualifying offer, which I don't know at this point if it'll happen, because they mentioned the 3-year deal. I mean, should he take the 3-year deal because you get 2 years guaranteed and then the option? Maybe that's just a better, I could understand like if it was the 2-year deal. And he's like, I'd rather take the qualifying offer because it's basically just 1 year
Yeah.
of guaranteed money. But the 3-year deal might be like, maybe you might want to take that one as opposed to the qualifying offer. But I guess it depends on how him and his agent feel. But as I've said, if he takes the qualifying offer, that window's shut just because you're not getting back anything for him. And if he stays, he's leaving and you're getting nothing back for him.
Yeah.
So like I said, the hope is that if you're Golden State, that he has to come back on some type of non-qualifying offer contract, and who the heck knows?
Yeah. What a disaster.
Yeah, so I don't even have as many more thoughts. It kind of gets annoying at a certain point.
I'm fed up.
Yeah, because like because at least like with the Butler situation, it was annoying and obnoxious, but you at least kind of knew like, okay, there's a world where if he goes to a team, he could make them a lot better. I know we were kind of like, how much is he really going to do just because, like, he's the health and everything, but he was at least a proven guy. But like with Kaminga, he hasn't really proven much in terms of being a part of a winning team.
Nothing.
I know that 2 seasons ago, right, he started a lot of games the latter part of the season, and yeah, they bounced back, but they didn't even make the playoffs, right? So
Nope.
I just think like as I've said many times, the role that he sees himself playing on this team is not going to happen. He's not going to be a featured offensive player on a team that's got Steph and Jimmy Butler. He needs to be a guy that has to buy in to, doing all the other little things, and doesn't seem like he wants to do that. And I understand because he wants his money, he wants to play, and he wants a defined role that's beyond just that. But it's not going to happen on this team. So either he's going to need to take that offer that they gave him, or they need to adjust the offer, or he takes qualifying offer. So
Yep.
yeah. So moving on. After that, now we have, I guess, as our usual closeout moment for this, polls and comments that we read. So the first one is the poll, and the question was, do you agree with our tier list? And this was relative to the Eastern Conference, right? And this one was not quite as controversial as the other one, right? This one was 50-50, yes, no, because with the Eastern Conference, and I'll read, like I said, the comments. There's a few, I think, teams that people may have some qualms with, but with the Eastern Conference, when you structure it out, it does feel like at the very least everybody pretty much probably agrees on tier 1, And then everything else is kind of is what it is, where it's like, yeah, there's probably some differences here and there, but there's only but so many directions you can really realistically go.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the outcomes I think here are going to be interesting, but the problem is the quality of the conference is the issue here because at a certain point you already know some teams just aren't going to make the cut. And it's completely different than the Western Conference. So yeah, I think that does make sense though.
Yeah. And then last but not least, the comments. So there was like kind of a discussion that I had with somebody on our YouTube short. And he basically asked a question of, the Celtics, right? He basically said, like, you guys left out the Celtics. How come? And then, somebody else replied and was like, probably because of Tatum, but he should be healthy in time anyways. Plus, they got a roster that doesn't require him to make a decent run. And my response was mainly that, if Tatum was healthy going into the season, they would be there, but there's no guarantee he comes back. And I'm just not sold on the big man rotation that they have because I just think it's a lot worse than what they had before. Where I'm like, I think this might be a gap year, right? But the guy at least said he feels like that they should be above the Sixers and that he thinks that we're kind of sleeping on Jaylen Brown and he thinks that they're right up there with the Pistons and the Hawks without Tatum. Which and then I asked him kind of like, was it more so that you're lower on the Hawks and the Pistons or just higher on the Celtics? And it was more so that he's higher on Boston. And like I said, my concern mainly is that I think they're going to miss. I mean, he's their best player, but just because he does so many other things, I feel like they're going to miss a lot of that, right? Like, it's like you have worse bigs. So if you had a healthy Tatum, he's the guy that does a lot of the rebounding and help defense and extra playmaking, but you're not going to have that. And I don't think Brown is that type of player where I don't think he can replicate everything that Jason Tatum does. I mean, as a scorer, sure, but I don't think he can replicate a lot of the other stuff, even though he's really good. And I think he'll have a bounce back year because he had kind of a disappointing season, I think, last year. I felt like, on the offensive end, at least, it felt like he took a step back
I agree.
compared to what he was the year before. And I think that was one of the reasons why they came up short, in addition to the injuries and everything else. But just, it's more, I guess it's more so the question of, can Jaylen Brown put on his best impersonation of Jason Tatum? Can he do it? And I think, like I said, as a scorer, he can. And maybe as a defender, well, for sure as a defender, because he's probably a better one-on-one defender than Jason Tatum.
Mm-hmm.
But just in terms of the other areas of defense, and then the other areas like rebounding and assisting, I don't think he's as good as that other stuff as Tatum, which is not a knock on him. But I think they're going to miss that, especially with, to me, a worse supporting cast.
Yeah, I could understand where the guy's coming from who commented this, right? Especially when it comes to the whole Philly thing, because in theory, right, like
SO Bliss 5,200.
Yeah, like we appreciate the comment, but with Philly, that's a tough one too because that one's more like predicated on their health, right? So what do they look like? And on paper, fully healthy. Because the thing is, we're excluding Tatum, right? Like that was kind of a given. But we're not really excluding Embiid, but maybe we should have. I don't know, but I would still take Philly because I think they're a little bit more of a complete roster, and like you said, there are holes on the Celtics roster that indicate, okay, we don't necessarily have to be the worst team, but we're not going to contend because we already know that we're going to be missing Tatum for a significant period of time. But no Porzingis, no Horford, no Cornette, and also no Drew Holiday. I mean, it's a completely different look. So I am expecting them to not be as good and honestly really not contend.
Yeah, and I think that's what I think the team is okay with that.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah.
Well, that ends today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments about all these questions we had about all these teams going into the season, whether or not you agree or disagree. Maybe you have additional questions, and if somebody leaves them in the comments, we might address them. As we usually do, right? If you leave a comment on any of our socials, we'll usually read them at the end of the episode, and of course, continue to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. We just got a few new subscribers as well, anyways, right? So thanks for that. And as the season starts up, it's getting pretty exciting. I think there's going to be a lot of good basketball to see next year with a lot of good teams that are going to try to compete. And thanks everybody for watching. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next episode.